as soon as you make an argument like this, you're immediately, and I call this fascio-casting. People are kind of like magically declare you're a right wing or a fascist or conservative, and then they don't have to listen to you anymore. I tend to worry that in an environment that's already hostile to the message, it's just going to be co-opted, taken over by administrators, and people are going to end up having a target on their back. Many students and professors were getting in trouble for what they said. But man, has it gotten worse. This is really bad, people. Like, there is no historical precedent for this.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, welcome to The Contrarian podcast. This is your host, David Bernstein. Today with us, we have Greg Lukianoff, the CEO of FIRE, the activist that I admire most, the person who's really been leading the charge for freedom of speech on campuses and now off campuses as well. Greg, welcome.
Thanks for having me, David.
All right. So, you've been with FIRE for
23 years.
23 years. That's amazing. Most of that time, it's been really exclusively devoted to the campus life. You broadened that mission, which I want to hear about. But I'm just curious. I mean, how would you characterize the shift in campus culture in the 23 years you've been doing this work?
Oof, yeah. So when I started back in 2001, I was a weird law student who went to law school specifically to do First Amendment law. So this is my passion. This is what I wanted to do with my life. And even in 2001, when I joined this then tiny organization that was only a year and a half old, and I was only one of 6 employees, I was surprised that already in 2001, it was easier to get in trouble for what you said on campus than I thought. Stanford Law School, where I was, there definitely was a little bit of an atmosphere of it's really easy to say the wrong thing, but you generally wouldn't get in formal trouble for it. It would be more kind of, it was easy to anger a certain subset of students, overwhelmingly people who, went to elite colleges. But in 2001, I was surprised that it was, that as many students and professors were getting in trouble for what they said. But man, has it gotten worse. And particularly over the last, 6 or 7 years, the amount of targeting of professors is unlike anything I've ever seen. And that's one of the reasons why Ricky and I decided to write Canceling of the American Mind. It's just to put all the data in front of people and the examples and the arguments to explain. It's like, this is really bad, people. Like, there is no historical precedent for this. Even if you go back to the Red Scare, the McCarthyism, you're talking about, about half as many professors fired during the 11 years of the Red Scare than in 9.5 years of what we call, and even though it's a controversial term in some circles and not at all in most others, cancel culture, which we give the official start date around 2014, which is when we really, me and Haidt and so many others, noticed something had really shifted on campus.
Yeah. At that time, by the way, I was executive director of a pro-Israel advocacy organization that dealt with campuses called the David Project. And I remember coming back to campus, I think it was in the fall of 2014. And this is right after Ferguson protests. And I know you looked at Tumblr and other factors, and you could not believe the shift in campus attitude then. We were stunned. And I write about this in my book, Woke Anti-Semitism, as well, is that the campus ideology seemed to change almost overnight from what I would have called soft postmodernism, that is, that everybody's story is equal and we should honor everybody's story. Maybe not the most rigorous intellectual framework in the world, but better than what succeeded it. And what succeeded it was what I would call like a hard postmodernism, which is like, oppressed versus oppressor. And it was remarkable to see how much that had infiltrated into the campus discourse so quickly. And from like that 2013 to 2014 handover. And it sounds like you saw the same. And I remember reading about it in the Codling, or the first Codling. Obviously, we're seeing that in the data, by the way, as well. I know that there's been studies of sort of the level of censoriousness in American culture, and that in the data, it also shows that that people are self-censoring at higher rates today than they were during the McCarthy era.
Yeah, no, that was interesting because there was a Giants survey done of what had happened during McCarthyism right at the tail end of it, right around 1957, 1958. And they polled professors asking them, are you toning down your published papers? And about 9% of professors said that they were. And that's really bad. I always try to point out, it's like almost 1 in 10 is a terrible number for professors to be saying that. But you ask them basically the same question today, and I think it's something more like a third of professors are saying they're toning it down in their papers. But when you ask them, are they self-censoring, in extramural speech, which is speaking off campus, or about things off campus, like being on Twitter, for example, is extramural speech, intramural speech, which is complaining about the university, or in your classroom or in your research, 90% of them said, I absolutely am. So it's one of these things where trying to convey how bad it's gotten can be so difficult for the very problems we point out in Canceling of the American Mind. Right. And that's why we refer to this sort of way of protecting yourself from having to address your opponent's arguments on the left. And we take on both right and left in the book, to be clear. But on the left, we call it the perfect rhetorical fortress. And as soon as you make an argument like this, you're immediately, and I call this fascio-casting. People are kind of like magically declare you're a right wing or a fascist or conservative, and then they don't have to listen to you anymore. So it's hard to get this message to get through. It seems to be getting through to most of the rest of the American public, but in elite, and I use that term not to mean special people, to just something more akin to sort of ruling class kind of structured people, which every society has, to be clear. And that it has a harder time breaking into there. Right.
So obviously we had this moment, I guess we're calling it December 5th, with the resonance of a 9/11 or an October 7th, but December 5th, where these 3 university presidents are brought before, Congress to talk about what's going on in their campuses. And it's, I think it's probably a set of hearings was watched by more Americans than almost any other hearings on policy matters, at least in recent memory. I'm curious to get your take on it. It seems to me that there might be both opportunities and threats there. Yeah. How do you see it?
Well, I think that when those 3 university presidents went into that room, particularly Harvard and Penn, they were already, the game was already lost, because both Penn and Harvard had been so bad on free speech, it was impossible to get the people in that room to believe that they were suddenly good on the free speech rights of pro-Palestinians when they'd been, lamenting the horrible curse of fat phobia just a couple of weeks before.
Right.
So I think there's a way that they could have played it, but it would have required, Harvard to be a lot more honest and self-effacing than it's ever used to being, saying, oh, we've actually been terrible on free speech for a long time now. They weren't willing to say that.
Right.
I do think, and I'm going to be very frank about this, I got depressed writing Canceling of the American Mind. Even though I've been doing this for 23 years, it's a very different experience. Oh, and I should always say, with Ricky Schlott, who's absolutely brilliant. She's a 23-year-old. I could not have had a better person to write with, other than Haidt, of course. I've been very blessed by my co-authors.
Yes, you have.
But partially because of this phenomena where I knew that people could just dismiss us, if they didn't want to hear this argument, and we allow for that in even in intellectual circles. But post October 7th, I will say one good thing came out of that on campus. It was the awareness to a much broader scale of people that something much more serious is wrong with higher ed than we previously saw. This is something when I did the Bill Maher show back in December, and I didn't even have to say that, because Bill was kind of like,
he got it.
I don't run into anybody anymore who says there's nothing wrong on campus. Unfortunately, I do run into them.
Yeah,
I think academics are still like, oh no, it's just a right-wing plot. to say there's something wrong in higher ed. But most normies, and I think for that matter, most professors know that something's amiss, to say the least.
Yeah. It seemed to me that those presidents had two ways out, neither of which they were actually could pull off. But one was to say, yeah, you're right. We've been terrible on free speech and we've been very censorious, but from here on out, we're really going to commit ourselves to doing better in that way. And I understand why you might think we're hypocritical. The other way out, which I would not favor, but I think would have been a way out, would have been to say, we're private universities. We don't have an absolute obligation to provide free speech. We have hate speech policies, and we've failed at that as well because we're not applying them to Jews as we have other protected categories of minorities. Again, I think that would have also helped them, but I don't think that they could have said either of those things because they would have faced the music back at home on their own campuses, and their own campuses that's not how they think about these issues.
When I think through what they could have said, one was, we've shown gross double standards and we've been hypocrites on this stuff. Not willing to say that. Mm-hmm. And then say, and anti-Semitism is a very real problem, particularly on elite campuses. And I also always say, and also schools in California in particular, at least in my experience.
Yes.
And they're unwilling to say that because that would have, you always have to say, but there's also this massive Islamophobia problem. And it's like, really? I'm not really seeing that in the numbers in terms of who's afraid to talk. So I think there were two things that they could have said that would have helped them out, both of which they were completely unwilling to say.
Yes, exactly. So I want to get into some of the challenging free speech issues. I'm somebody who works for a Jewish organization. We're concerned about the campus environment. And I've been talking to a number of really major thinkers, people that mm-hmm. Who have been about a tension between, let's say, free speech and equal protection. So I've been talking to people like Gene Volokh and my namesake David E. Bernstein at George Mason Law, who I'm confused with on probably 3 times a week.
That little,
actually, and some of them are unbelievable. By the way, Ilya Shapiro and Nadine Strawson, I know, a good friend, and Randy Barnett at Georgetown, Ken Marcus at the Brandeis Center. These are very smart people. And
Nadine Strawson, I'm proud to say, is actually a senior fellow at FIRE,
exactly.
Which is a mind-blowing experience for me because I met her back when she was president. I met her as just a fanboy back when I was in law school, and the fact I get to work with her now just blows me away.
She's amazing, yes.
Oh, yeah.
And the funny thing is, I'm asking him this question, okay? And the question goes something like this. It says, all of us prefer free speech. And I've noted, by the way, that the campuses that are on the rock bottom of the FIRE survey, Harvard and Penn, are also those that have some of the most hostility toward Jewish students.
And our research shows that too, by the way. I can talk about some of that data as well.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. And so I strongly prefer free speech, but I also understand that in certain places they don't have free speech cultures, that they're not really working toward free speech culture. Yeah. And as some of my colleagues might say, as among those listed, equal protection is a liberal value too. Mm-hmm. And if the campus is not extending equal protection to Jewish students, then they should. Then they ought to. And yet that might not be the measures that they're willing to take are not those that would actually bring us closer to a free speech culture, which is what we prefer. So what does a Jew like me, or it doesn't have to be a Jew, it could be a thoughtful human being like you, do about this seeming double standard there? Should we do what Eugene Volokh said and said, I don't want equal protection of repression? Mm-hmm. Or should we do what I think probably Ken Marcus would suggest, or even my namesake David E. Bernstein or Randy Barnett sort of hinted at, and say, look, in the meantime, you must have equal protection, and we expect you to treat Jews as you would every other protected minority. How do you think about that?
I think it's tough because on the one hand, is there, like I said, there's anti-Semitism on a lot of these campuses, and the first thing is when it isn't protected speech at all, you have to clamp down on that. You have to actually go after the students who are engaging in outright assault, as we've seen in a number of schools, the students who engage in violence, like we saw at Berkeley, mm-hmm. in order to scare off an IDF speaker. The ones who engage in violence, they should be expelled.
Right.
To be clear. And people sometimes are kind of like, well, Mr. Free Speech. Oh, you're saying that these students should be expelled for their expression. I'm like, no, violence is not expression.
Right.
Particularly violence trying to shut down expression is mob censorship. Like that has no place at a university. So you have to actually stop having some of these double standards in the first place. But there's a problem. And this is something that John Haidt and I talk a lot about, and we that's why we re-upped Chapter 3 of Coddling the American Mind. A lot of the much maligned and kind of deservedly so DEI infrastructure, kind of the operating system of that is intersectionality and Kendian sort of anti-racism. And there's kind of no way to make that infrastructure not anti-Semitic, because basically, like, if you have a wildly oversimplified picture of the world in which the world is simply divided into oppressors versus the oppressed, and white people are always the oppressors, that's most Jews.
Yes.
I mean, the amazing thing, of course, is this ends up being so oversimplified. You're oftentimes talking to people who aren't aware that there is such a thing as non-white Jews. But
Right.
don't get me started on the ignorance that often attends this as well. So I think that the idea that they should enforce these things equally, just as much to protect pro-Palestinian students and Jewish students at the same level, it's not going to happen, because these are biased administrators, and they play a role. And this is the thing that people are missing.
Yes.
The DEI administrators, they play a role in shout downs. They play a role. Sometimes they just let people off the hook when they've done protests that they kind of agree with or kind of support. Sometimes they cater the takeovers of the president's office, and that's for real. This has happened repeatedly, including at Harvard, that these ferocious takeovers of the president's office have featured Harvard-supplied burritos. But in some cases, that they're helping put the shout downs together. And outside of the context of anti-Semitism, we have a whole chapter in Canceling the American Mind on how my alma mater, Stanford Law School, embarrassed itself when Judge Kyle Duncan came there, because about a fifth of the students showed up to shout him down. But that was after hours and hours meeting with DEI administrators in advance. Then there's like a 10-minute shout down, precisely 10-minute shout down. Then the head DEI administrator gets up and reads a prepared statement.
Yes.
And it's kind of like, and I don't think we're ever going to get one where it's as transparently obvious that this was students and faculty working together, other than a case we talked about way back in Can We Take a Joke, a documentary we did on censorship, where we actually had it in writing that the administrators had prepared students to disrupt a play that they didn't like, and bought them tickets for them to attend. Like those are the kind of evidence you're not going to see. But I can attest from doing this for a long time, these administrators, they're pushing along the censorship of opinions they don't like. So you really can't trust this apparatus to do right by American Jews in the first place. So I definitely get the idea. Listen, we're going to have repression. It should at least be equal. It won't be. But I also want to be clear. Threats are not protected, nor should they be. Discriminatory harassment is not protected, nor should it be. And that's severe, persistent, pervasive discrimination against a person or group on the basis of that group membership, which is one of the reasons why when I look at the Title VI lawsuit that was filed against Harvard, I of course, there was an immediate reaction to, condemn this lawsuit. And then, of course, we all looked at it fire like, listen, if they can prove this stuff, like they can have the Harvard's in big trouble. So, I think there are a number of things that Jews can do to protect their rights, to make sure that they're safe. But I do think that hoping that the DEI apparatus can suddenly become their friend is unrealistic.
There are some interesting edge cases I'm wondering about, though. There was this woman, I think she's a law professor at Columbia, named, is it Catherine Frank? And she made some statements suggesting that that the university should reject Israeli students who have been in the IDF. Somehow disqualifying. And you start to wonder, okay, that could be speech treated as speech. She, but at the same time, is she going to be a fair-minded professor to his Israeli law students? I mean, do you have any thoughts on those on that particular case study, assuming it's stated correctly?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Can you say, as a professor, in my opinion, we shouldn't take people who served in the German military, the Russian military, the American military, or the IDF? Yeah, that's protected speech. When it comes to the idea that the professor could be biased against Jews, I actually take that seriously. But here's part of the problem and why this is such a difficult problem to fix. The normal remedy for being a bad professor is for your department to investigate you and for the department to decide that you haven't lived up to professional standards in a way that is free of partisan politics, not necessarily inner office politics, but in a way that is fair and as objective and unbiased as possible. But it's really hard to trust a lot of these departments that they'll do this, that they will figure out anyway. It's hard to not have become cynical watching so much of this. If they don't like you as a professor, they will find a way to get you fired or not to stand up for your academic freedom. If they like you, if they like your opinion and it's popular, and at Columbia, a pretty hard anti-Israel and even anti-Semitic speech is distressingly popular, they're going to say, no, you get a pass. So this is one of the reasons why I think sometimes when I talk about like how bad the rot is, people are kind of like, oh, you're not one of those people saying burn it all down. I'm like, of course I'm not saying burn it all down. We wouldn't be doing the campus free speech ranking if we didn't think some schools were better than others. But I do want people to be going clear-eyed about the fact that the problems are profound.
Let me ask you another question related to that. I came into contact with this program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and it's a state university, but probably more ideological even than many of the private universities that we're familiar with. And they have some kind of center for anti-racism there, and they were promoting an institute called the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism.
Oh boy!
Now, I'm
sure it'll be fair.
I'm sure it'll be fair. Now, okay, let's leave aside for a second. You can be a professor and you can have your opinion about Zionism, no problem. But if you have a program like that, or you have an academic center like that, it seems to me very unlikely that you could be a student who doesn't agree with you sort of anti-racism pieties, who could go into a classroom like that and have a voice, be able to articulate something different than the professor wants you to. These programs are not predicated on sort of open inquiry in the least. And I'm wondering if there's any recourse for that. So let's say your universities, I'm a trustee in a university. I said, we should do an audit of all classes. Now, I'm not going to punish the university, the professor, for having a different opinion. But if they don't allow open inquiry, or they're not exposing students to multiple sources with different points of view, then they're not doing their job. I don't care if they're tenured or not. What do you think about that?
Well, when it comes to the California system, FIRE has a lawsuit right now against the entire community college system of California.
Right. Because
they actually require professors to include in their syllabuses, include in their classrooms, intersectionality, anti-racism, all of these, forgive the expression, kind of like woke ideological pieties. And this extends even to chemistry professors. Like we had a hysterical quote from one of our plaintiffs saying, okay, so how exactly am I supposed to take an anti-racist view of the atomic weight of boron? These things don't even apply. And when it comes to these politicized centers, I think objecting to them, is absolutely something that people can do, and that can be effective potentially. That this is going to be, just more bias on the part of the ideology that's going to be okay, and this center is already going to be baked in. But the fact that might not succeed at a lot of these campuses, that they'll just have their ears sealed to these kind of arguments, is a big part of the problem, and one of the reasons why I think that I end up arguing more about here's my big issue with University of Austin, like the experiment that they're doing out there. We need 1,000 of them. We don't just need one of them. And what I'm talking a lot about lately is something that I want people to take a deep breath and understand that institutional decay is, in a sense, normal. And when institutions don't have, they can't renew, where they're not like the corporate world where eventually corporations go bankrupt and they fail. And that's considered healthy. Higher ed hasn't had the kind of creative destruction that is so healthy in other institutions. And we're seeing rot.
Yeah, we are seeing rot. And one of the solutions that I like and interventions I like is sort of these centers for civic thought that are emerging in certain universities where there's sort of alternative centers for open inquiry. Now, I know it should be, shouldn't that be the entire campus? Well, it should be the entire campus, but it's not. So if you create sort of a protected branch in the university where you attract some of the best professors who actually want to teach, in the liberal tradition, and you attract students who want to be taught in the liberal tradition, you might be able to then create more compelling places, and ultimately some of the grievance studies programs and the like start to sort of decay on the vine, and these become the dominant teaching and dominant approaches. What do you think about that? Is that one way to scale the University of Austin, Texas?
Maybe. But the problem there is so often when you create a center like this, it gets co-opted. I wish I could remember exactly the scenario here. So the problem with anti-Semitism in California schools in particular goes way back. And I remember an attempt to address this. I can't remember which school. They tried to have an anti-Semitism ombudsman. In order to fight it. And guess who became the anti-Semitism ombudsman? Right. The single most anti-Israel professor on campus. Jewish, but still very, very anti-Israel. So I tend to worry that in an environment that's already hostile to the message, it's just going to be co-opted, taken over by administrators, and people are going to end up having a target on their back. I mean, this is essentially what I think happened to Ilya. Georgetown was trying to course correct a little bit by having a center for constitutional law. Randy Barnett helped with it, and they tried to get a real dyed-in-the-wool conservative, Ilya, to be in charge of it. Now, of course, he said something pretty stupid to tweet out. This is, he apologized for it himself. About how it was a bad idea. But the sentiment is something that it was a common sentiment when you look at polling, that it was inappropriate for Biden to say that he was looking for a black woman to be the new head of the Supreme Court. And people also argue that devalues whoever you end up actually picking. And he complained about this in a somewhat intemperate tweet. But they obviously protected, obviously the kind of thing that they would absolutely let fly if it had been someone saying the same thing about a Trump appointee. And they investigated him for the whole semester, even though it was clear that he hadn't violated any policies. So I think that within institution fixes without more are going to face some serious problems. That's one of the reasons why when we have a list of 10 things that universities can do to help improve the situation for academic freedom. I think schools should do all 10 of them. But one that just can't be replaced is you have to seriously debureaucratize. And it can't just be the DEI administrators either, because if you go after DEI by name, they're just going to call themselves something different.
Okay. Right. So let's talk about how to intervene for a second. And here I'm going to raise a controversial figure, Chris Rufo. But I want to, for a second, sort of unpack Chris Rufo or the Chris Rufo enterprise. You could I know, look, you post Stop Woke in Florida, and there's
it's unconstitutional.
It's unconstitutional, and sort of this divisive concept stuff is really highly problematic, and I'm sure unconstitutional. But but he makes a larger point, and I want to steelman that for a second. His larger point is, look, guys, I know you're a nice. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. You're a nice, sweet bunch of liberals who are your hearts are in the right place, but let's be real. We need politics, and politics is more of a sledgehammer than it is a scalpel. And you can be stuck forever with what you have, and then write nice, beautiful op-eds, and and some of that will work. But you have to be willing to sort of use the political tools that exist, and that's congressional intervention or it's the governor's executive order, and we should be fully on board with a governor saying DEI in my state universities is no longer welcome, which I think the governor of Oklahoma did, or passing legislation that does the same thing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna. So Chris Rufo hates my guts, and he hates FIRE for taking on the Stop Woke Act, and also for me pointing out that I believe in reform more than practically anybody in the country in higher ed. But step one of trying to actually reform it, you have to pass something that's freaking constitutional. That's not going to be laughed out of court like the Stop Woke Act was. And we tried to warn them. We did warn them over and over again. And then we sued and we won. No surprises there. But yeah, he hates my guts. Doesn't mean I hate his. And I actually thought his book, I forget what the title of it was.
Yeah, I'm blanking on it.
The Second American Revolution, or something like that. It's actually really quite a good book. And I think a lot of the things that he does, pointing out a lot of these figures who are venerated on campus, whether it be Herbert Marcuse, or some of the Weather Underground people, for example, are to really give people a sense of how monstrous they could be. I mean, and I say that explaining that Herbert Marcuse still thought Mao was pretty great in the 1970s. Weather Underground people thought that you'd have to kill millions of Americans in order to fix the country. These are people who thought really awful, primitive, ugly things about their countrymen. And then they recommended illiberal solutions based on, power dynamics. I think he's right about all of this. And so how do you fight it? Well, you have to figure out ways that are constitutional. And so you'll note that when it comes to some of the suggestions for K through 12, my only difference there is that I've recommended positive values as a way to, rather than saying we don't teach the following 50 things, my recommendation has been in something I call the empowering of the American mind, positive values that are completely inconsistent with things like identity politics, critical race theory, and that kind of stuff. I think that's just a better way to do it.
Yeah.
But as far as the people coming out and trying to pretend that, I can't believe the state is exercising power over K through 12 curriculum in public schools. It's kind of like, where have you been? Like the idea that the state should have no say and voters should have no say and parents should have no say in what gets taught in our public schools. And by the way, my kids attend a public school, is madness. The idea of giving that all to education school graduates is just completely insane. Yeah. So I think that even though I don't always necessarily agree with some of the nuts and bolts of the K through 12 reforms, I just partially because I have my own ideas on what it should look like, which is a slightly different philosophy. It doesn't mean I think that there's a lot to fix there, and it's appropriate that there be state oversight. Yeah. When it comes to higher ed, you can't pass something that's not going to stand up to constitutional muster. But I think there's lots of things that states can do to help. And I do think that, debureaucratizing is a huge part of that solution. I think they can set up new institutions. I think they can change existing ones. I think so I've been writing a lot about potential solutions to these problems. But I think that a big part of it, probably the most drastic thing that I believe, is that a lot fewer jobs need to require a BA. I think that we've put a generation in debt for degrees of questionable value, only to sort of benefit a massive, industry that is decaying in a way. Now, okay, to be clear, there is amazing and important research going on in American universities. I don't want to devalue that. I just think that when it comes to anything that's political or politicized, those institutions are not trusted, and they actually undermine the credibility of higher ed to be an honest broker of what's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So by the way, you'd mentioned the empowerment of the American mind. My organization has helped set in motion something called the Coalition for Empowered Education, which is a multi-ethnic group dedicated to providing an alternative to radical ethnic studies coming out of California. And we are specifically using an empowered pedagogy instead of just talking about what's wrong with ethnic studies, and there's a tremendous amount wrong with the liberated model of ethnic studies. We are trying to replace it with something much more positive, very much in the spirit that you just spoke. But that said, okay. So are you okay with the governor saying, I'm sorry, no more? Is your understanding of debureaucratization, would that be consistent with saying DEI department, I'm sorry, you no longer exist?
Getting rid of the administrative DEI department?
Yeah, yes.
They should. And here's one of the reasons why, from an academic freedom and free speech argument, you should be. They're basically the orthodoxy police on campus.
Right.
And in some cases, they literally run the bias-related incident program. In some cases, they literally are the ones investigating professors for being not sufficiently doctrinaire. Yeah, no, those should go. We do object when it says something about, when it goes into the classroom and when it says what students can and can't do. But that's also pretty well established in the law, that there's a major distinction between administrative offices and professors. But that's also the limitations of the law as well. So in some cases, starting a new, and states can do this as well, with new colleges, for example, might be the way to go. But fixing the problem of the lack of viewpoint diversity in the professorate, which is part of the problem, it's not easy. One thing I did get a little bit excited about, though, was that at Dartmouth, they seem to be trying some smart things. And one of the things that they're trying is to have a lot more classes that are co-taught between professors who disagree with each other.
Cool.
That's a cool possibility. It's a better way of teaching, in my opinion, because it doesn't give people the oversimplified view of the world that one opinion is right and one opinion, the other one is evil, or evil and stupid generally. And that could be a great way potentially to bring in some viewpoint diversity. But I know a lot of departments will fight that tooth and nail.
Right. So there have been some modest efforts to reform DEI, and as we know that there are certain liberal pluralistic DEI practices. And it seems to me that in red states, getting a governor or a legislature to go and debureaucratize is a doable proposition. In blue states, I think it's going to be very hard to get them excited to do that. Maybe that will shift over time. What do you think about this idea that in red states we'll push to sort of ban and debureaucratize, and in blue states we'll see if reform can work in a few places? And is that doable, or do you think we should just have a very clear stance of trying to debureaucratize?
I think debureaucratizing in general is just a win-win. I feel like that these are the orthodoxy police. They are, and what people have to pay attention to. I get annoyed with this one. Oh, but like the what students are actually paying out of pocket has largely flatlined, and that poorer students, like I was, can have access to all sorts of scholarships, which I always feel a little bit grumpy about because I got baited and switched by my undergrad alma mater, which means I went in close to a free ride, and then they kept on chipping away at my scholarships every year. So I know full well that isn't necessarily a guarantee that you'll be just fine. But I think that what people have to look at is the per student cost for a single year of education, the pure student expense per year. And I think at Yale, for example, I really want to triple, quadruple check the math on this, but it seemed like we were talking about $200,000 per student per year was basically what they were spending, which is insane. A failure. If you can't educate people for less than $200,000 a year, you've done something wrong. So I talk a lot about some of the things that I think legislatures could really do is to prevent anti-competitive moves by the massive and wealthy higher education juggernaut, to stop cheaper, higher rigor alternatives to higher education as it currently exists.
Yeah, I know you said you got a little excited by what Dartmouth was doing. Is there any? Do you feel like we're at a turning point, like that December 5th might have been a turning point, that the discourse is shifting in a way that might actually lead to some of these hard-fought reforms?
I don't know. Because here's my hope is that we'll start having serious conversations about what can actually be done. And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of those solutions are going to be bipartisan. I think they're probably, and that makes everything harder. You're going to have the entire knowledge producing class, up in arms about, how dare you, cut funding to some of these schools to reduce bureaucratization. And my fear is that what's going to happen is this could be like the first great age of political correctness, which is essentially you went from a pretty healthy environment for academic freedom and free speech for a period there. And then you had the great, political correctness crack up of the mid 80s through the mid 90s at a number of schools across the country. And then when things got when the speech codes were defeated in court, and by the way, the last one, Stanford Law School, in 1995, and political correctness had kind of become a joke off campus, there was a sense of, thank goodness that's over. And I feel like we went from a not great environment for academic freedom and free speech, maybe like a C+ in 2014, maybe B-, to a F-, in 2020, 2021. And it's going to get up to a D-, and we're going to be like, phew, thank goodness that's over. So my fear is that there's a huge desire to just say, oh, people are slightly more sane than they were a couple of years ago, so I guess that's all over, right?
Yeah, I hope we don't settle with a D-. Maybe the blessings of a B- might not be a bad idea, but D- seems very low, and it just seems to me that we're embarking on an important but uncertain enterprise here into trying to transform universities. But I don't see how we can not do it, because I think that universities have been sort of the source of a lot of the ideological turmoil that we're in today. And yeah, I'm sure there are other factors now. Social media has become a factor in and of itself, and it's, jumped the lab into K through 12, and it's jumped the lab into corporations and so forth. But it seems to me that you want to get to the source, and there's no way around this. We've got to fight the good fight here.
Yep. No, agreed. And I will say this about the predicting things over the next 10 years. We're heading into a period, I believe, of some big changes. I just don't know for the life of me what they're going to look like.
Right.
Because I see, like, no matter who wins the election at the end of this year, there's going to be some political turmoil. I think that's unavoidable. I think the geopolitical situation is rough. Not to sound too dark about it, but I feel like we're essentially in an undeclared war with Iran at the moment, and Russia. We very much are in a proxy war with Russia. Russia's getting armament from North Korea, the craziest of all countries, and China. I feel like everyone's always just waiting for the other shoe to drop when it comes to Taiwan, and so like the next, I would say that if talking to me maybe 10 years ago, I had a lot more of the Pinkarian sort of optimist about it. But I think we're going to go through a period of big, fast-moving, in some cases possibly scary changes, and I don't know where we're going to end up on the other side of that.
Yeah.
Ta-da! Cheery thought.
Right. One last question, and we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
Just because I cannot not ask it to you. There's been a lot of talk about the role that Qatar has played. And
I like when NPR had tried to get everyone to say it right, and Qatar.
Right.
Tried to make
Qatar.
Yeah.
They just pronounce it Gutter.
Yeah.
So what is your take on all that?
It worries me, and I think there should be transparency on where schools are getting their money. I think that I get, frankly, a little bit more worried about Chinese influence on a lot of schools. My colleague, Sarah McLaughlin at FIRE, is writing a book about the reach of the Chinese government onto American campuses, and how they're able to intimidate Chinese students in the United States out of saying anything critical of China, in some cases by threatening their families back home. And there's been all sorts of shenanigans coming out. So I do think that we're being played internationally in any variety of ways. I don't know as much about what the Qataris are doing. But I think that there needs to be transparency on this issue.
All right. Well, Greg, look, thank you for both your scholarship and your activism. You're one of those rare people that combines both. And I think it's you're doing a very important work for us all. So appreciate that very much. Thanks for being on The Contrarian.
Real pleasure chatting with you, David.
Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.